It was a crisp autumn morning when Emma and her best friend, Jake, decided to hike the Black Ridge Trail. The trail was known for its stunning views of the valley below, but it was also notoriously isolated. Emma had always loved hiking, and Jake was the kind of guy who never turned down an adventure. They packed light, just some water, snacks, and a first aid kit, and set off early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail was well marked, and the forest was alive with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves. Emma felt at peace, the stress of her daily life melting away with every step. Jake was his usual self, cracking jokes and pointing out interesting plants along the way. But as they ventured deeper into the woods, something began to feel off. The birds stopped singing. The rustling leaves grew louder, almost as if something was moving through the underbrush. Emma tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just the wind. But the silence was unnerving. Even Jake seemed to sense it, his jokes drying up as they walked. "Do you hear that?" Emma asked suddenly, stopping in her tracks. Jake paused, listening. "Hear what?" "It sounds like whispering," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper itself. Jake frowned. "Probably just the wind. Come on, let's keep going." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The whispers grew louder as they walked, though she couldn't make out any words. It was as if the forest itself was speaking to them, its voice low and guttural. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone, or something, following them. But the trail behind them was empty. The trail began to narrow, the trees closing in on either side. The sunlight barely filtered through the dense canopy, casting the forest floor in an eerie, greenish glow. Emma's unease grew with every step. She tried to focus on the trail ahead, but the whispers were impossible to ignore. They seemed to come from all around her, closing in, growing louder. "Jake, I don't like this," Emma said, her voice trembling. "Something's not right." Jake stopped and turned to face her. "It's just your imagination. We're fine. Let's just get to the overlook and head back, okay?" Emma nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her chest. They continued walking, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. And then, they heard it. A scream. High-pitched and piercing, it echoed through the trees, sending a chill down Emma's spine. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "What was that?" she whispered. Jake's face was pale. "I don't know. Maybe an animal?" But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. And it was close. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the forest itself was warning them to leave. Emma's instincts screamed at her to turn back, but Jake insisted they keep going. "We're almost there," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The trail opened up into a small clearing, and that's when they saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows of the trees. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the darkness. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. "Jake," Emma whispered, her voice trembling. Jake grabbed her arm and pulled her back. "Run." They turned and bolted down the trail, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. The figure didn't follow them, but the feeling of being watched lingered. They ran until their lungs burned, not stopping until they reached the trailhead. When they finally made it back to their car, Emma collapsed against the hood, her chest heaving. Jake was pale and silent, his usual bravado gone. They didn't speak about what they had seen. Not then. Not ever. But to this day, Emma refuses to hike the Black Ridge Trail again. And sometimes, when she's alone in the woods, she swears she can still hear the whispers, low and guttural, warning her to leave. It was supposed to be a solo hike, a chance for Mark to clear his head after a rough week. The Silver Peak Trail was one of his favorites, a challenging but rewarding route that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding mountains. He had hiked it dozens of times before, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the overcast sky, or the way the wind seemed to howl through the trees. Or maybe it was the feeling that he wasn't alone. Mark had been on the trail for about 2 hours when he first noticed it. A shadow just out of the corner of his eye. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he continued walking, the shadow seemed to follow him. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the trail ahead, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. The trail grew steeper, the trees thinning out as he climbed higher. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint metallic smell that made Mark's stomach churn. He paused to catch his breath, glancing over his shoulder. The shadow was still there, lingering just out of sight. It was tall and thin, its shape vaguely human but distorted, as if it were made of smoke. Mark's heart began to race. He told himself it was just his imagination, but deep down he knew something was wrong. He quickened his pace, his boots crunching against the rocky trail. The shadow kept pace with him, always just out of reach, always watching. As he reached the ridge, the sky darkened, the clouds rolling in like a storm. The wind howled, drowning out all other sounds. Mark's unease grew with every step. He glanced over his shoulder again, and this time, the shadow was closer. Much closer. He could see its outline now, its elongated limbs and featureless face. It didn't move like a person. It glided, its movements smooth and unnatural. Mark's breath came in short, panicked gasps. He broke into a run, his heart pounding in his chest. The trail was narrow here, the drop-off on one side steep and unforgiving. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel the shadow closing in, its presence like a cold hand on the back of his neck. And then, he heard it. A voice, low and guttural, whispering his name. Mark. He froze, his blood turning to ice. The voice came again, louder this time. Mark, don't run. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The shadow was right behind him, its featureless face inches from his own. He could feel its breath, cold and damp, against his skin. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a rock. He fell, his body sliding toward the edge of the ridge. He grabbed onto a jagged rock, his fingers slipping as he struggled to pull himself up. The shadow loomed over him, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. Mark? It whispered again, its voice filled with malice. With a final burst of strength, Mark pulled himself up and scrambled away from the edge. He didn't look back. He ran, his legs burning, his lungs screaming for air. The shadow followed, its whispers growing louder, more frantic. He didn't know how long he ran, but eventually, he reached the trailhead. His car was there, a beacon of safety in the growing darkness. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unlock the door. He jumped inside and locked the doors, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He glanced out the window, half expecting to see the shadow standing there, watching him. But the trailhead was empty. The forest was silent. Mark drove home in a daze, his mind racing. He tried to convince himself it had all been in his head, a product of exhaustion and stress. But deep down, he knew the truth. The shadow had been real, and it had known his name. He didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadow, its featureless face inches from his own, its voice whispering his name. He tried to shake it off, but the memory lingered, like a stain on his mind. A week later, Mark received a package in the mail. There was no return address, just his name scrawled on the front in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of him, taken on the trail. He was standing on the ridge, his back to the camera. And behind him, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure. Mark's hands trembled as he stared at the photo. He didn't know who had taken it, or how they had gotten so close without him noticing. But one thing was clear. The shadow was real, and it wasn't done with him. To this day, Mark refuses to hike alone, and sometimes when he's walking in the woods, he swears he can hear the whispers, low and guttural, calling his name. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance for Sarah and her friends, Mia and Chris, to disconnect from the world and reconnect with nature. They had chosen the Pine Ridge Trail, a remote hiking route that led to an old, abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The cabin was rumored to be haunted, but they didn't believe in ghosts. They were there for the adventure, the thrill of exploring somewhere off the beaten path. The hike was grueling, the trail overgrown and barely visible in places. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead and blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of their boots on the forest floor and the occasional call of a distant bird. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin was exactly as they had imagined, old and weathered, its wooden walls warped and cracked with age. The windows were dark, the door hanging slightly ajar. It looked like something out of a horror movie, but Sarah couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement. "This is it," she said, grinning at her friends. "The infamous Pine Ridge cabin. Let's check it out." Mia hesitated, her eyes darting to the dark windows. "I don't know, Sarah. It looks creepy." Chris laughed, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Come on, Mia. Don't tell me you're scared of a little cabin?" Mia rolled her eyes but followed them inside. The interior was just as eerie as the exterior. The floorboards creaked under their weight, and the air was thick with dust. The furniture was old and broken, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. There was a fireplace in the corner, its hearth filled with ashes, and a single rusted lantern hanging from the ceiling. They decided to spend the night, setting up their sleeping bags in the main room. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew quiet, the silence almost oppressive. Sarah tried to shake off the unease, telling herself it was just her imagination. But as the hours passed, the feeling grew stronger. It started with the whispers, faint and indistinct. They seemed to come from the walls themselves. Sarah sat up, her heart pounding. "Do you guys hear that?" Mia and Chris were already awake, their faces pale in the dim light of their flashlights. "Yeah," Chris said, his voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be coming from all around them, filling the room with a low, guttural hum. Sarah's skin crawled as she realized the whispers weren't random. They were forming words, her name. They were saying her name. "Sarah," the voices whispered, low and menacing. "Sarah, stay with us." She scrambled to her feet, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "We need to get out of here. Now." But as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the cabin. Chris rushed to the door, yanking on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck," he shouted, his voice filled with panic. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. The air grew colder, their breath visible in the dim light. Sarah's flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker. And then they saw it. A figure, standing in the corner of the room. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadows. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it were being pulled by invisible strings. It stepped forward, its head tilting to one side, and the whispers stopped. "Sarah," it said, its voice deep and guttural. "You shouldn't have come here." Sarah's heart raced as she backed away, her flashlight flickering again. The figure stepped closer, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. Mia screamed, clutching Chris's arm. "What is that?" The figure didn't answer. It just kept coming, its movements slow and deliberate. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. The windows were too small to climb through, and the door was still stuck. They were trapped. And then, the lantern above them flickered to life, casting the room in an eerie orange glow. The figure stopped, its head tilting again as if listening to something. Sarah held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers returned, louder, this time more frantic. They seemed to be coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The figure stepped back, its form dissolving into the shadows. The door creaked open, the cold night air rushing in. "Go," the voices whispered. "Go now." Sarah didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed her backpack and bolted for the door, Mia and Chris close behind. They ran through the forest, the whispers fading behind them. They didn't stop until they reached the trailhead, their lungs burning, their legs shaking. They didn't speak about what had happened. Not then. Not ever. But to this day, Sarah can't shake the feeling that they didn't escape the cabin. Because sometimes, when she's alone in the woods, she hears the whispers again, low and guttural, calling her name. And sometimes, she swears she sees the figure, standing in the shadows, watching her. And there you have it. 3 chilling trail hiking horror stories that will make you think twice before venturing into the woods. From whispering forests to shadowy figures and haunted cabins, these tales remind us that sometimes the scariest things aren't in the dark. They're waiting for us in the light. But here's the thing. These stories aren't just meant to scare you. They're a reminder that the world is full of mysteries we can't explain. So the next time you're out on a hike, and you hear a whisper or see a shadow where there shouldn't be one, don't ignore it, because you never know what might be waiting for you. If these stories gave you chills, don't forget to hit that like button and let me know in the comments which one scared you the most. Was it the whispering woods, the shadow on the ridge, or the cabin in the pines? Share this video with your friends who love a good scare, and make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a spine-tingling story. Thanks for watching, and remember, if you hear a whisper in the woods or see something strange on the trail, keep your wits about you. Stay curious, stay scared, and I'll see you in the next video.